FA fam. What's up? What's happening? Hope everybody's having a great week. Hope everybody had a great Christmas. Hope everybody has a great New Year's this week. Stay safe. But I hope, most importantly, I hope everybody made it to the Fantasy Championship. And that's why you're watching this, because you're getting ready to take that chip. First things first, let's just go ahead and jump right into it. Let's start off with our Week 17 rankings, and then we'll jump into some of the fantasy goodness. So, to start things off, we have Jonathan Taylor. Surprise, surprise. One good note that it's possible that Carson Wentz could return this week, something we'll have to monitor. Nick Chubb gets an absolute smash matchup against Pittsburgh, who's been just dreadful against the run this year. Dalvin Cook, Austin Eckler, who should be back from COVID, Joe Mixon, Alvin Kamara, a little bit tougher to trust. Hopefully some of the quarterbacks can be back this week because that will help out Alvin Kamara tremendously because Ian Book is terrible. David Montgomery, Aaron Jones, Najee Harris, Darrell Williams, Clyde Edwards-Helaire likely going to be out this week with a bruised shoulder, so that kind of makes Darrell Williams a pretty solid RB1 this week, even though it is against Cincinnati, who has been decent against the run this year, with Ronald Jones at number 11 and Elijah Mitchell at 12. Now, we've been talking about him for what seems to be weeks now to returning. Hopefully, he can return this week. As long as he does, this is an absolute electric spot against the Houston Texans, and I think he would be a pretty solid RB1 if he is able to return this week. That is a situation we'll have to monitor. Let's go to the RB2s. Rashaad Penny. Love to see that. Cordell Patterson, Sony Michel, Ezekiel Elliott, Josh Jacobs, Antonio Gibson, Damian Harris. Now, some people might be surprised with Damian Harris being at 19 because they're getting Jacksonville, but with Ramondre Stevenson possibly returning this week, I do think that hurts Damian Harris a little bit, and he is very much touchdown or bust. Now, don't get me wrong, this is against Jacksonville, but Ramondre Stevenson would cut into his workload once again and kind of limit his upside a little bit. Chase Edmonds, Devin Singletary, Javonte Williams, James Conner, and Saquon Barkley, who just barely made the cut. So let's go ahead and just jump right into some of these running backs that I really want to hit on today. First things first, I did want to talk about Ronald Jones, even though I have him as an RB1. Ronald Jones going against the New York Jets, one of the best matchups you could possibly get for a running back. Last week, in a really just a beatdown of Carolina, 53% of snaps, 20 carries, only 65 yards. But I will say this, Carolina has allowed the 11th fewest fantasy points to running backs, so they've actually been pretty good against running backs this year, although you wouldn't be able to tell because between the two, Ronald Jones and Keyshawn Vaughn, they both put up, almost 30 fantasy points against them. Keyshawn Vaughn going 7 carries, 70 yards, a touchdown, but majority of that came on a 55-yard touchdown run. So this is clearly Ronald Jones' backfield. He is not really going to be all that involved in the passing game, and I don't think so. They're going to need to against the Jets anyway, but the Jets have allowed the third most rushing yards, the most rushing touchdowns, the sixth most receptions, the second most receiving yards, and the third most receiving touchdowns to running backs. So this is an absolute smash spot for Ronald Jones. The only thing that does concern me with his ceiling would be I think he would need to get like multiple touchdowns to really hit a really high ceiling, but this is a great matchup. I could see him definitely going well over 100 yards and at least a score in this game. So Ronald Jones, I think you lock him in here. I'm not really all that concerned with Le'Veon Bell, who they brought in, and I don't think Keyshawn Vaughn is going to be ripping off 50-yard touchdowns every week. So I think you can feel pretty confident with Ronald Jones, and you probably see his snap share go up a little bit too. So anyways, let's jump over to Rashaad Penny. Here we are. League winner, Rashaad Penny, to you. He has now been a top 10 fantasy running back in 2 of the last 3 weeks, minus the LA Rams game. But regardless, last week, 52% of the snaps, 17 carries, 10 routes run, 1 target, 135 rushing yards, and 1 touchdown in that game. Now, the Lions have been terrible against opposing running backs. 3rd most fantasy points to running backs, 6th most rushing yards, and the 4th most rushing touchdowns, and 28th in rush DVOA. Rashaad Penny has absolutely been kind of a league winner. Somebody that people have added, and now he didn't really work out in week 15 in that week, but he bounced back in a big way last week against Chicago and dropping another 20 fantasy points in that game. So Rashaad Penny, and for another great matchup again, feel pretty confident in firing up Rashaad Penny. Sony Michel is next up versus Baltimore. Now, this is a tougher matchup. Baltimore has actually been pretty good against running backs. 13th fewest fantasy points to running backs, the 4th fewest rushing yards, 17th most touchdowns, though. They haven't had through the air like all things. 6th most receiving yards and the 12th most receiving touchdowns on the year. Now, the positive is Darrell Henderson is out with an MCL. He's going to be out 3 to 5 weeks. He may be done for the year. But Cam Akers there's a possibility Cam Akers could return. I think that's more of just a feel-good story. I don't think it's really going to affect Sony Michel, who has just been an absolute monster over the last 4 weeks. Over the last 4 weeks, he is averaging 22 carries per game, 115 total yards, almost half a touchdown, 16 fantasy points per game, 20 routes run, and a 2.5 targets per game. over that span, which is absolutely ridiculous. Sony Michel has been excellent with him out, and I don't think that's going to change. I don't think Cam Akers comes back and takes over this backfield. Ain't going to happen coming off an Achilles. I think this is more of a kind of get right spot for him. Work him in slowly. He probably sees 6 to 8 carries, maybe a couple targets, and that's about it. Kind of what we were seeing with Darrell Henderson. I think this is Sony Michel's backfield right now, and I would expect he probably plays 70, 80% of the backfield and probably sees the majority of the touches in this back. Next up, we have Zeke Elliott. I want to hit on him really quickly against the Cardinals. Now, last week, he did play 58% of the snaps, but this was an absolute beatdown against Washington football team. 9 carries, 42 yards, 2 touchdowns, 1 target, 17.2 fantasy points in that one. Now, like I said, they absolutely smashed the Washington football team, so they didn't have to do a whole lot in that game, right? And so, however, really the last 2 weeks, we've started to see him get a little bit better, 16.2 fantasy points prior to that, but hasn't had a 100-yard game since week 6 against New England. It's been a very long time. He's been getting there on touchdowns and pretty much touchdowns alone. Now, the Cardinals have allowed the 10th fewest fantasy points, but they've allowed the 13th most rushing yards, 2nd fewest touchdowns. It's really where they have kind of been able to hold opposing teams. Only allowed 5 rushing touchdowns on the season. That is tied with only the Saints on the year. But the Cardinals have been gashed all year for big runs. And so Zeke worries me a little bit. I don't think he has an incredibly high ceiling, but if he can get you 16, 18 fantasy points, we're going to be happy with that and take it. He's not a league-winning running back. He's just not. But I think in this matchup, we're definitely starting him against the Cardinals. Next up, we have Chase Edmonds, who is on the other side of this game. Week 16 played 92% of the snaps, 65% of the touches, 16 carries, 8 receptions on 9 targets, 127 total yards, 1 tutty, and 26.7 fantasy points. Now, that was without James Conner, so that should definitely be mentioned. James Conner should be back this week, but I do not expect James Conner to come back and just completely relegate this entire backfield. This ain't not going to happen. Chase Edmonds likely goes back and being a little bit more of a 50-50 split. He's definitely going to be utilized more as a pass catcher. On the season, he has averaged 4.3 targets per game. On the year, 11.8 fantasy points per game, but he's been super efficient. 23rd in yards created per touch, 5.1 true yards per carry, which is 6th most among all running backs at 11th in juke rate, where James Conner averages 3.6 true yards per carry, 61st among all running backs, but he's 16th in evaded tackles, 28th in juke rate, 26th in yards created per touch. Where we all know where this is coming from, where this fantasy points is 16.5 fantasy points per game is the touchdown department. 16 tutties on the year for James Conner. Who would have thought that? Certainly not me. But Dallas, 3rd fewest fantasy points to running backs, 12th fewest rushing yards, and the 8th fewest rushing touchdowns. They've been really good against opposing running backs. I think you see them really trying to target running backs out of the backfield here, especially without a guy like DeAndre Hopkins. So I think that's where it really bodes well for Chase Edmonds. It is definitely the preferred pass catcher in this backfield. So I like Chase Edmonds this week. Next up, we have Devin Singletary. I could probably have Devin Singletary higher. I probably will end up moving him higher because he is in a great spot and he really has taken over this backfield. 71% of the snaps, 12 carries last week, 78 total yards, 5 receptions on 6 targets. Love to see that. 1 touchdown, 18.8 PPR points. But this wasn't just the one matchup. In the last 3 weeks, he's faced New England, Carolina, and Tampa Bay. He has received 82% of the snaps, 12.6 carries per game, 87.6 total yards, 2 touchdowns, 4.6 targets per game, 4 receptions per game, 16.7 fantasy points per game. And this week, he gets a dream matchup against Atlanta, who allowed the 9th most fantasy points per game, 15th most rushing yards, 11th most rushing touchdowns, and 25th in rush DVOA, and turned 23rd in adjusted line yards. This is definitely a defense that we want to target with running backs. Now, I get it. Sometimes it's a little bit nervous because you're with Josh Allen there. We know his propensity to run the ball and snipe some of those touchdowns away from the running back. But Devin Singletary playing this amount of snaps, seeing this kind of opportunity, it is really hard to set somebody like Devin Singletary. So I think you can lean on Devin Singletary against Atlanta. A strong RB2, especially with the pass catching work. See, the fact that he's seeing 4 receptions a game is almost like getting an extra touchdown per game. And I don't think anything changes here. So start Devin Singletary with absolute confidence. Next up, last but not least, I just want to hit on a couple running backs very quickly. Javonte Williams continues to be a very startable commodity as like a back-end RB2 every single week. Double-digit fantasy points in 5 straight games. He did score 20 PPR points the last time he played the Chargers. So I do think you can play Javonte Williams once again with confidence this week. He's still splitting with Melvin Gordon. The Chargers have been really bad against opposing running backs this year. And, we've already seen with Javonte Williams, but you can play him with confidence. Next up, we have Saquon. I have him at 24. That might even be a little bit high. It is really hard to trust Saquon Barkley right now. I think you can sit him if you have a better option. If you have somebody like we've talked about, like a Devin Singletary or Chase Edmonds or Sony Michel, obviously, or Rashaad Penny, all those guys, Ronald Jones, I'm definitely starting over Saquon Barkley. You just can't. He makes it really hard to trust, even though it's not a bad matchup against Chicago. They allow the 18th most fantasy points to running backs, 8th most rushing yards, and the 16th most touchdowns on the season. But over the last 2 weeks, 3.8 fantasy points, 9.4 fantasy points for Saquon Barkley. And it is really discouraging because last week he only ran 8 routes last week and only 1 target. Like, the only way he was even worthy of a start because of his pass catching work. Prior to that, he was seeing 8, 3, 9, 5, 6 targets over that span. So the targets were there, and it was kind of keeping him afloat, making him a decent option. I mean, he's only scored 1 touchdown since week 4 against New Orleans. So if he's not going to see the touchdowns, it makes him really hard to start. So you can sit Saquon Barkley if you have to. Pains me to say, I love Saquon. I hope everybody has a good week. Let's win some chips. Be sure to drop your comments in the comment section below. If you have any questions, start, sit, whatever it may be, we are here to help. And we will be going live Wednesday night this week, Saturday night, and Sunday morning for all your start, sit questions. So keep it locked in here. We are not going anywhere. And we will be back again on Wednesday night to answer your start, sit questions. Let's win those chips this week. Congratulations, you've made it. Now we just got to finish it. Like Kobe said, job's not done. Job's not done. Peace.